everyone, Robin from Backscatter here, and in this video we're going to cover how to take great underwater wide-angle photos with the Olympus E-PL10 and the Backscatter Octo housing. We made this guide for underwater photographers who want the best wide-angle image quality and easiest shooting experience possible from this camera underwater. Our goal here is to get you shooting in manual mode with our easy custom settings to achieve the best photos in the simplest way. If you're a new shooter, you might be tempted to just put your camera into auto mode because it seems simple, but the problem is that auto mode tends to create these overexposed, bright, kind of cyan green backgrounds and underexposed dark foregrounds for a pretty lackluster image. By dialing in our easy custom settings in manual mode, we can create deeper, darker blue backgrounds and vibrant pops of color in the foreground, and will prevent the camera from making automatic exposure choices that would make sense when shooting on land, but just straight up don't work underwater. The key thing to remember is that shooting with custom settings in manual mode is actually way easier than you might think, so don't be intimidated. This video is going to teach you everything that you need to know in simple terms in order to get outstanding wide-angle results. We're going to get the camera preset so that the only two things that you need to adjust underwater are your shutter speed for the background exposure and your flash power for the foreground exposure. After seeing how simple it is to shoot in manual mode and how good the results can be, you're never going to go back to shooting in an auto mode again. This is our cheat sheet of everything that you need to know in order to get great wide-angle photos with the E-PL10. We've separated our easy custom settings into two categories, on the boat and in the water. On the boat settings are the kind of things that we're going to set once and then just forget about, while the in the water settings and techniques we'll need to work with during our dive. All of the info on this guide can be found as a free download at backscatter.com, which is at the link in the video description. We'll spend the rest of this video breaking down what all of this stuff means and how to get it dialed in on your camera. I'll put up a little camera nerd alert when we go a little deep into the need-to-know details behind some of the given settings. We're going to cover all of the essential gear that you'll need first, since we can't shoot wide without the right equipment. Then we'll get into the set once and forget on the boat settings, followed by the more adjustable in the water settings. Wide-angle photography is defined as using a lens with a super wide field of view. We need this in order to get as close to our subject as we can so that we're shooting through the least amount of water possible for the best overall color, contrast, and clarity in our image while still fitting our large subject into the frame. The 14 to 42 millimeter EZ lens and the flat port that are included with the E-PL10 and the Octo housing just aren't wide enough on their own to shoot a truly wide-angle perspective. This stock lens setup is great for those medium-sized fish portrait shots, but it's just not going to allow us to get as close as we need to be to large subjects because they won't fit in the frame. There's a few different ways to use a wide-angle lens with this camera, but the Backscatter recommended wide-angle setup is the AOI UWL09 Pro wet lens paired with the stock 14 to 42 millimeter EZ. The UWL09 Pro offers 130 degrees of wide-angle coverage and the greatest amount of zoom flexibility, while also being the easiest setup for novice shooters to use. It allows you to zoom from a super wide shot down to a fish portrait without actually having to change the lens. The optics are razor sharp and produce the best, most detailed wide-angle images available from this camera. It's even better in terms of full corner-to-corner image sharpness than what a dedicated interchangeable lens can produce. A major advantage of using the UWL09 Pro is that it just works with the included lens and port and only requires a quick connect bayonet mount to pair it for easy on-off accessibility. This also makes it great for swapping out to macro optics either underwater or in between dives without having to break the vacuum seal of the housing. The only downsides are those that are universal among all wet lenses. It must be burped once underwater at the start of the dive to clear the airspace between the lens and the port, and because of that little airspace, it's not really practical for doing split shots as water's going to drain out at the surface, ruining that water line. An alternative wet lens setup uses our popular M52 wide-angle lens that a lot of Olympus TG camera shooters already own. If you're stepping up from a TG to the E-PL10 and you already own this lens, you can totally just start out with it. The Octo housing has 67mm threads, while the lens itself has 52mm, so you will need a bayonet mounting system to adapt it. The trade-off here is that the M52 wide-angle lens is narrower at only 100 degrees when paired with the 14 to 42mm lens, as compared to the 120 degree coverage that it provides when used on the TG6 and the 130 degrees of coverage that the UWL09 Pro provides. Its image detail also isn't as sharp as the UWL09 Pro when used with the E-PL10, and it shares the same universal drawbacks of requiring a burp at the start of the dive and isn't practical for shooting split shots. If you're an advanced user that really wants to shoot split shots with an ultra-wide field of view, you can go with an interchangeable 8mm fisheye lens and a dedicated dome port. These lenses can be difficult to use because they offer no zoom and you have to get just inches away from your subject to fill the frame. So for every situation other than shooting split shots, we strongly recommend the vastly more versatile UWL09 Pro and its superior corner-to-corner image sharpness, zoom range, swappability, and just ease of use for novice underwater photographers. We can shoot wide-angle photos with or without strobes, but for most typical wide-angle reef scenes, the goal is to highlight a foreground subject and make it stand out from the environment with a bright pop of color, which is why we need our strobes. If you're shooting with strobes, then our shots are going to have that pop of natural color where the strobe light hits, but everything beyond that will be more washed out with that overall cyan color cast. If you're only shooting with natural light, then our entire scene is going to have that more overall cyan, blue, green kind of tone to it. This is correctable to a certain extent using a manual white balance in camera or by just color correcting a raw image during editing, both of which we're going to cover in detail later. Ambient light only shots are better for much larger subjects that you couldn't possibly hope to light with just a pair of strobes, talking things like shipwrecks and huge natural formations. A major advantage of shooting with strobes is the ability to better freeze fast-moving subjects without having to set a prohibitively fast shutter speed to balance out our exposure. If we have a subject on the move that we can get within range of our strobes, then we need to pop it with a flash to make it appear still in our shots. Subjects will need to be about no further than 1 meter away for your strobes to be effective. So remember our simple mantra for this. If you can't reach out and touch that subject, then you also can't light it. You can use just a single strobe when shooting wide angle, but it's going to be better suited for vertical shots rather than horizontal, and you're going to be a little more challenged to work with the shadows that it'll produce. For the best vertical results when shooting with just a single strobe, keep that strobe up high and angled down, lighting from the top part of the frame. For the most versatility, use dual strobes for even coverage on those horizontal scenes. It's much easier to pull off satisfying wide-angle shots when shooting with 2 strobes than just 1. Also, keep in mind, most underwater photos are done with strobes rather than ambient light alone, so for the most versatility, we highly recommend having strobes. You can always just turn those strobes off if you want to only shoot with ambient light. While not essential for everyone, The UMG-01 and UMG-05 magnifying viewfinders can be a really helpful, practical accessory. A lot of Olympus TG camera shooters already have these for their housings, and they're going to carry right over to the E-PL10 and the Octo housing. When shooting in bright, clear water that produces a lot of glare on the LCD screen in the back of the housing, you can use the UMG-01 to create an SLR-like loop-style viewfinder to cut out that glare while also magnifying the back of the screen to make it easier to see. The UMG-05 45-degree viewfinder is helpful for shooting upwards, like when you're composing an overhead sunball shot, while allowing you to keep a more natural position to the rig and still be able to see the screen. It also has the same benefit of eliminating any glare with that SLR-like loop-style viewfinder. Both of these viewfinders easily just pop on or off of the back of the housing, depending on what works best for the situation. We're going to go through all of the on-the-boat menu settings first because they're truly set and forget. Then we'll cover the on-the-boat focus settings, then on-the-boat exposure settings. First things first, rotate the mode dial to M for manual mode. We'll cover everything that you need to know about shooting in manual when we get to the exposure settings, but there's some menu settings we're about to adjust first that we do want applied within this mode. Unless you literally just took the camera out of the box and powered it on for the first time, go ahead and perform a full camera reset to restore all the default settings to make it easier to follow along in this video. Go to the main menu, Shooting Menu 1, Reset, Full, and Confirm. And here's a quick tip. You can hit the Info button at any time in the main menu to toggle the little pop-up menu descriptions on or off. These can be helpful for getting familiar with your camera, but after you know what everything is, you don't really need them. Live View Boost brightens the on-screen preview image so that we can more easily see what it is we're working with and better compose our shots. From the main menu, select the Custom menu, then page C1 and turn on Live View Boost. Highlight and shadow warnings provide us with a quick preview of the blown out highlights and lost shadow detail areas in our shot. These warnings appear in the areas of our shot that are either so bright or so dark that they're clipping and losing any sort of recoverable detail. There just won't be any digital information captured in these areas for us to recover during editing, so we need this feature to help us quickly determine what flash power adjustments we need to make in order to avoid blowing anything out and losing detail on that area. Bring up the main menu, and while still in Custom Menu C1, bring up the Playback Info settings, select Playback Info, and then turn on Highlight and Shadows. Now, when you bring up your images by hitting the playback button, they'll blink blue over the darkest areas of shadow and orange for the brightest areas of highlights, which is what we really want to pay attention to for wide angle. We'll use this instant feedback tool to judge our exposure in the water, which we'll explain in detail in that section. Then, still in the custom menu, head down to page F and change the color space to Adobe RGB. This is going to capture images in a wider color gamut than sRGB so that we have more latitude to work with during editing. Scroll down from the custom menu to the setup menu and then over to Rec View. This setting controls how long your image is displayed on the LCD screen for review right after you capture it. The default setting for this is only half a second, which is kind of annoying because it's not really long enough to check for meaningful detail. If you're a novice shooter, you'll probably want to boost this up to 2 seconds. That's our favorite balance point between getting a good look at your shot and not having the image up so long that it creates an interruption while you're shooting. But what it really does is it gives you a practical chance to look at it and determine if you need to actually spend more time reviewing it. If you're a bit more of an experienced shooter, then we've got a simple setting that'll actually allow for faster shooting. Our recommended method is to just set this to off, and then instead you can just hit the playback button when you want to bring up your shots for review. We do this because nothing is more annoying in the heat of the moment when you're trying to capture some split-second action and every shot results in a screen takeover pop-up which requires either a half press of the shutter button or an entirely different button press to cancel. You're going to end up with a lot more shots to choose from in those fast action moments if you can just fire away without interruption and then review the shots at will after the action's over. The E-PL10 captures photos in either RAW or JPEG file formats. The difference is that RAW photos are uncompressed and can be heavily edited without quality loss, but RAW requires a program like Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop to develop and export the images from. JPEG files are compressed and can't be edited as much, but they are ready to share as soon as they're shot. We highly recommend shooting exclusively in RAW and using Adobe Lightroom to import, organize, develop, and export your photos. If you'd rather just do some quick edits, like maybe on your phone, and then post your shots right away, then shooting in JPEG is fine. Just make sure you're selecting the highest quality setting. The biggest reason that we advocate for shooting in RAW underwater is white balance correction. Even if you don't plan to do any major editing on your photos, the one thing you should really do is just a one-click white balance correction. This can bring those ambient light blue, green, cyan color tones back up to a much warmer and natural looking level. RAW files can be re-white balanced all day long in editing non-destructively, but you just can't do this on a JPEG without heavy quality loss. There is the option to record in both file formats simultaneously, but there's really not much reason to do so. It takes longer to write both of these types of files to the memory card, and they're going to end up taking up more space than just one or the other. When shooting with strobes, keep the white balance set to its default auto setting. We're going to be close enough to our subjects and we'll have enough light from our strobe that we really don't need to worry about compensating for any color loss where our strobe light is hitting. If shooting without strobes and only using ambient light, you can still just keep the white balance set to auto and then simply shoot in RAW and correct during editing with that one-click white balance like we just covered in the previous section. This is the method that's going to work best for probably 99% of shooters. If you want to be a little bit more of a camera nerd when shooting with only ambient light, no strobes, then you can execute a manual white balance. This method is a little more advanced, but it is better overall for the most accurate color results in camera. A manual white balance tells the camera what to use as a baseline neutral color. This is what helps us compensate for the natural loss of the red, orange, and yellow color spectrum as we descend deeper and deeper into the blue-green color spectrum of the water column. You need to use this option if you're shooting with ambient light only in JPEG, where you have to get the color right in camera, since any changes during editing are going to lead to quality loss, unlike the non-destructive changes to RAW files. When shooting in RAW though, the more accurate you can get the color in camera, the more range you'll have to work with during editing, so there is an argument to be made to do this there as well. Executing a manual white balance is pretty easy. Just scroll over to one of the 4 manual white balance banks, then hit the info button and point the camera at your neutral target, which is ideally a patch of sand or a white-ish part of the reef, but you can also use a white fin or a neutral colored dive slate, or even just the lighter skin on the palm of your hand, and then hit the shutter button. You can confirm your selection if it looks good, or just re-execute if it doesn't. The E-PL10 is going to capture a natural looking ambient light only white balance down to about 40 feet in depth, and you'll want to capture a new white balance for every 10 feet in depth that you change. So that's all the menu stuff out of the way. Now let's break down what we need to know about focus. We can do a lot to correct some little exposure mistakes when editing, But if our image isn't in focus and sharp, then none of that other stuff really matters. Fortunately for us E-PL10 users, the camera's continuous autofocus tracking feature works really well, so we can basically just lock onto our target, hold focus on it, and then fire after composing the shot. To activate the focus tracking, bring up the quick menu, select the focus modes, and scroll all the way over to continuous autofocus tracking and hit OK. Then you want to hit left on the directional pad to bring up the autofocus area selector, and then hit info to toggle the controls. Use left or right to turn face detection off, and press up or down to set the autofocus area to just a single point in the center of the frame. Now we can simply aim the center of the frame at what we want to focus on, half press and hold on it, and the camera will track and update focus as we recompose the shot exactly how we want it. If you lose focus on what you're tracking, just release the button and reacquire. The default setting for every camera out there is to have a half press of the shutter button activate the autofocus. This might make sense on land, but it can be a challenge to steadily hold a half press of the shutter button when dealing with an underwater housing control and trying to track and follow a subject. It's hard to feel that little half press of the shutter button stop sometimes, and you're almost guaranteed to accidentally snap a few pictures before you meant to. When the autofocus is controlled with the shutter button like this, you must reacquire focus with every shot. Starting from scratch on every frame can be a major challenge, especially when both you and your subject are moving. Fortunately, we've got a setting that's easily going to overcome this challenge. Most experienced underwater photographers prefer to actually assign the focus function to a thumb-activated button on the back of the housing. This technique is just called back button autofocus. Back button autofocus gives you the option to simply use your thumb to activate and hold the focus while it tracks, leaving your index finger free to snap the frame. The key benefit of separating focus away from the shutter button is that the camera will no longer attempt to refocus with every half press of the shutter button. The only thing that the shutter button actually does is take the picture. This allows you to shoot faster and with greater control, and it's really the way to go. Now, depending on your personal preference, you may choose to just leave focus set to the half press of the shutter method, but if you want to set up back button autofocus, P.S. you really should, here is how you do it. Bring up the main menu, head down to the gear icon custom menu, page A, and then select AEL, AFL, then CAF, and set it to mode 3. This is the setting that actually takes autofocus away from the shutter and moves it to the AEL, AFL function. So now let's set up that AEL, AFL function to be at our thumb button. Go down to page B in the menu, select button function, FN function, and set that to AEL, AFL. Now our custom assignable function button right next to our thumb rest will activate autofocus and will continue to track your subject as long as it's held. When you're ready, just snap your frame with your index finger. There's 4 settings that determine exposure, which is just how bright or how dark your image is. These are aperture, ISO, shutter speed, and flash power. The cool thing here is that we can preset aperture and ISO, so they're just going to be locked in for our entire time in the water. We only need to tweak shutter speed for background exposure and flash power for foreground exposure while in the water. These are the quick settings that we like to jump in the water with when shooting wide angle every time. Our aperture is set to f8, ISO is set to 200, shutter speed is 1/125th, and our strobes are set to full power. These settings are pretty middle of the road and are going to work well in most high visibility conditions with plenty of available light. We'll cover the aperture and ISO on the boat since they're going to be locked in, then we'll go over the shutter speed for background exposure and flash for foreground exposure in the water. So let's set our aperture, also known as the f-stop. The aperture is the size of the lens opening, and it primarily controls how much depth of field or in focus area that we have in our shot, in addition to affecting the overall brightness of the scene. Hit up or the little plus minus button on the D-pad, and then use the right button to set your aperture to f8. The higher the f-stop number, or the higher the aperture value, the smaller the light collecting iris on the lens becomes. Increasing the aperture value creates a smaller hole, so this will not only make the scene darker, but it also creates more in-focus depth of field. We need to stop down this aperture to create more depth of field for sharper, more detailed corners in our shot. If the aperture were to be opened up too wide, it would create much more blurry, soft corners in our photos. Since f8 is an ideal balance between the brightness and the corner sharpness, we'll just leave it locked in there. Then bring up the quick menu, select ISO, and change it from auto to 200. ISO controls how sensitive the camera's sensor is to light. Increasing the ISO value will make the scene brighter, but it also creates more grainy digital noise in our shot. Our goal is to preserve the best image quality, so we want ISO set to the lowest value of 200. Even at this lowest sensitivity setting, our other exposure factors will allow us to create a sufficiently bright photo, so no worries there. This is also something we don't need to change, so just leave it locked. So now with our back button autofocus tracking and our exposure jump settings dialed in, we're fully preset for success on a wide-angle photo dive. Load the camera into the housing, make sure you have the zoom gear on the 14-42 lens, and make sure that the hot shoe is connected for the LED flash trigger and that is turned on. Also make sure you draw a vacuum to ensure that everything is sealed up nice and tight. And now we can cover what we need to know in the water. So now that we're safely in the water and have found a subject or scene to get set up on, let's focus on it and then adjust our exposure. Remember, we can do a lot to adjust our raw image exposure, but if it's not in focus, then nothing else matters. The trick to proper focus when shooting wide angle is to focus close. You always want to focus on the closest thing in the foreground. This will just about always need to be no more than that 1 meter or touching distance away. The continuous autofocus tracking feature is going to make pulling this off as easy as just pointing the center of our frame at the closest element, then holding and tracking focus on it, then simply recomposing the position of the frame exactly how you want it, and taking the photo. If you want to practice this technique, just find a nice stationary subject and set up on that. After you get the hang of it, then you can move on to moving subjects. Back on the boat, we locked our aperture at f8 for corner sharpness and ISO at 200 for image quality, so we only need to evaluate for the other two exposure factors in the water: shutter speed to affect our background blue exposure, and flash, or in this case our strobes, to light our foreground. To set the shutter speed, just use the top dial, which controls shutter speed in manual mode by default, and then set it to 1/125th of a second. You can alternatively set it by pressing up on the D-pad to activate it just like the aperture, but we find the dial to be easier to adjust on the fly. As we make the shutter speed faster, we're limiting how much light makes it through the lens to the sensor, creating less visible natural light and a darker background. The thing to remember about shutter speed is that in terms of overall exposure brightness, it only controls the ambient light. It has no effect on the strobe light. This is why we use the shutter speed independently to control the blue of the background exposure, while the strobes provide the pop of color and brightness of the foreground exposure. You can basically think of your shutter speed as a dial-a-blue control for your background. The first step to perfecting exposure is to dial in the background blues. You can even do this before finding a subject just by taking some test shots with your strobes off while hanging out anywhere with open water backgrounds to shoot. In most tropical clear water conditions with plenty of ambient light, our go-to shutter speed of 1/125th is going to be perfect for creating even, deep blues in the background. All conditions are different, and as long as we remember to treat our shutter speed as a dial-a-blue control, then you're going to be ready to adjust that on the fly for any situation or conditions. You want to get a darker blue result in clear, bright environments? Then take the shutter speed all the way up to its maximum flash synchronization speed of 1/250th of a second. Diving on a dark wall or a shadowed overhang without direct sunlight, then slow the shutter down to 1/60th to collect even more light. Keep the shutter speed within this range of 1/60th to 1/250th with 1/125th as a baseline reference, and that's all there is to it. Once you've got that ideal background exposure locked in, basically any shot with the same relative sun position overhead and amount of natural light available is going to be good to go. You should really only need to adjust your shutter speed if either of those things change. The RGB histogram is a graph representation of the brightness of the primary colors in our image. Understanding how to read the RGB histogram is a really powerful tool for perfecting that ideal blue water background color and avoiding the overexposed, less appealing cyan-toned brighter backgrounds. The RGB histogram is broken down into the overall luminance and the primary colors of red, green, and blue. The left side of the graph represents the darker shadowed tones, while the right side represents the brighter, more vibrant highlights. While using your shutter speed as a dial-a-blue background control, use the RGB histogram during image review to evaluate and make sure that you've got those blues set slightly underexposed. When checking your shots, find a blue background example that you like and then check the corresponding histogram. It should show a concentration of blue tones on the left side of the graph. Make a mental note of that result and try to aim for it in the future. Pretty soon, you're going to be able to tell when you've nailed that background color just by checking the RGB histogram alone. Set your strobe power to full power to start off. Every strobe out there is different, and every scene is different, and each are going to have a different ideal power setting based on our exposure settings. But as long as you're starting at full power, then you know you only have to turn the control knob one way, down, to adjust your power and get your test shot dialed in. Strobe power is all about distance to the subject. The further away the subject is and the larger the subject is, the more flash power that will be required to reach it. The effective limit of even the best strobes out there is about 1 meter, because the water itself acts as a filter and just sucks up all of that light. Remember, if you can't reach out and touch it, then you can't light it. Keep your strobe set at full power when shooting at that far limit, and then turn their power down as you push in closer and closer. Bring the strobe power down just one click and one test shot at a time as you move in closer until things start to look evenly lit and you're happy with the overall contrast in your image. Aiming your strobes is as easy as just pointing them at what you want to light. Bring the strobes out about an equal distance away from your camera as your camera is from what you want to light. Bring them up at least above the center line of your lens to prevent any unnatural underlighting, and keep the strobes pulled back behind the edges of your dome to avoid them blowing out the edges of the shot. angle your strobes so that you're only lighting the subject and not the water in between the subject and the lens. This usually either means pointing the strobes straight ahead or even just slightly outward. This is going to minimize lighting up any particles of backscatter that would reflect back in your shot. Keep your strobes out at that relatively equal distance from your housing as your housing is from your subject. If your subject is closer to the lens, bring your strobes closer too. Subject's further away, push your strobes further away too. We take a much more in-depth look at this and the variety of ways that you can position your strobes for different underwater shots in our Zen of Underwater Strobe Placement article and video, which is also linked in the video description, so be sure to watch that right after this. Judging for the proper strobe exposure is easy because we activated the highlight and shadow warnings in the menu. Just bring your image up for review and look for the blinking orange highlights in the shot. Anywhere that's blinking orange is totally blown out and starting to lack detail. Use this instant feedback to dial down your strobe power until you're just getting the smallest little blinks of orange on the brightest areas of the frame. A few bright highlights are exactly what we want, we just don't want everything so bright that we're clipping and losing detail. Using the highlight warnings as a gauge for your foreground exposure from your strobes, while using the RGB histogram to gauge your background exposure, is the secret sauce to getting the perfect in-camera exposure with the E-PL10 every time. The closer that you get the exposure to perfect in camera, the more room that you have to play with during editing, whether you're shooting JPEG or RAW. So now that you've got your strobe power dialed in, you can shoot subjects of a similar size at a similar distance without changing much. You might only be one click away on the strobe power dial from the ideal setting, if you even have to change it at all. The more that you can stick to shooting one size of subject, the less that you're going to have to adjust during your dive. So what do you do if you followed all these settings and your shots are still too dark or too bright or have boring color? Well, here's a few tips to try. If you aren't getting that vibrant pop of color on your foreground subjects, then it simply means you aren't getting close enough to hit them with your strobe light. Make sure that you're no more than 1 meter away at the maximum and that your strobes are aimed at the thing that you want to light. If you've got your shutter speed set to 1/250th and your background is still too bright, you can take the aperture down a few more stops too. Take the aperture from f8 down to f11 to create a darker overall scene without having to exceed the flash synchronization of the shutter speed. If you've got your shutter speed set to its minimum of 1/60th in a dark environment and the background is still too dark, then you can open the aperture up to f5.6. This will allow in more light than f8 without sacrificing corner sharpness. If going to f5.6 isn't enough and the scene is still dark, then you want to increase your ISO one stop at a time until it's bright enough. And a quick nerd alert on this, just keep in mind adjusting either the aperture or the ISO is going to affect the overall amount of light that gets let in, so you'll also need to adjust your strobe power relative to either of those overall exposure changes. So that's really all there is to capturing great wide-angle photos underwater with the Olympus E-PL10. It might seem like a lot, but it's actually pretty easy when you break it down. We simply preset our on-the-boat settings so the only things we need to manage in the water are the flash power for the foreground exposure and the shutter speed for the background exposure. Jump in the water at f8, ISO 200, 1/125th, and strobes at full, then find a test subject about 1 meter away, focus close, track focus using the back button autofocus, take one test shot at a time, adjust your shutter speed as a dial of blue for your background color while using the RGB histogram to judge, and then adjust your strobes to the correct power using highlight warnings to get them just right. Bring your strobes in closer as you turn their power down as you move in closer to your subject, always trying to keep the strobes about a relatively equal distance away and up above the center of the dome and pulled back behind the edge of the dome. Download the custom settings cheat sheet at the link in the description, and be sure to explore all of our other videos, reviews, articles, and the world's largest inventory of underwater photo and video gear at backscatter.com. Your purchases from Backscatter or our worldwide authorized dealers and our destination photo centers always include free lifetime tech support, and your support helps keep us making more of these videos. We dive, shoot, and service everything that we sell, and we're always happy to help when you need us. I'm Robin from Backscatter signing off, and happy shooting.